There are a lot of reasons why a person chooses to buy a given product or service, but the basic elements are utility, quality, aesthetics, price, and customer support. The more of these boxes you can check off, the more likely it is that a product will sell, or a service, for that matter. In a market with limited choices, a product or service that fulfills even one of these will likely have sales also. If you don't have a lot of choices, you'll take what's available. In a wealthy economy, all five are weighed in. However, in a poor or failing economy, only utility, price, and quality really matter. That is in order of importance. I've got an article here from BoydBiomedical.com, The Decline of American Manufacturing. Links will be pinned. Quote, manufacturing was left adjacent to America's new system of innovation because its existence was assumed to be institutionalized. It was not, and decades later this would prove to be a meaningful oversight, leaving manufacturing outside of a federal support structure, isolated it, and left it vulnerable. Over the second half of the century, structural economic changes occurred, and our isolated manufacturing base declined disproportionately as a result. Structural economic changes, would those happen to include the exportation of labor to foreign markets? Why, yes. Yes, they would. Beginning the quote again, in response to Japan's manufacturing quality revolution in the 1970s, financial pressure mounted to make American corporations more competitive. The idea that companies exist to create value for their shareholders became the dominant management philosophy. Increasing shareholder value was the primary concern driving corporate strategies. Public markets demanded that companies focus on core competencies and divest their non-core competencies. Shareholders rewarded corporations that did so, and their market values increased. This resulted in the proliferation of asset-light organizations that had fewer employees, were less diverse, and were less vertically integrated. Asset optimization led American corporations to transfer manufacturing functions outside the organization and, in many cases, abroad to lower-cost regions. As a result, the number of manufacturing plants in America employing more than 5,000 employees dropped from 192 in 1977 to 49 in the year 2007. In addition, the number of plants with more than 1,000 workers fell by half over the same period. End quote. For the glory of Wall Street. This is the after effects of a shareholder-driven marketplace, which we're still living in. Costs must be cut to appease the financial overlords, and if those costs happen to be people, so be it. Break out the scythe and harvest. Harvest till there's nothing left. Quote, in the following decades, in addition to outsourcing manufacturing, this shift diminished corporate contributions to everything else outside their core business. Harvard professor Gary Pisano and Willie Shai, I don't know how to say that, define everything else as the industrial commons. Pisano and Shih lay out the concept of the industrial commons in their book, Producing Prosperity. In the book, the authors liken their industrial commons to pastimes when farmers would share a local pasture as a community resource for their livestock. The commons were no single individual's responsibility, but if they were to fall into disrepair, everyone would suffer. The pasture of a modern industrial commons includes a labor pool, enabling technologies, and partners that support innovation from early-stage research to commercial production. This stands in contrast to a business cluster that aims to promote innovation and growth in one industry. Instead, a robust industrial commons serves many industries and is more innovative and resilient. In our modern economy, the ingredients of an industrial commons are more complex, but still somewhat surprisingly localized and geographically bound. They are an interconnected ecosystem of academia, government, and business in their simplest form. In America, our industrial commons have eroded significantly over the last 50 years, leaving small and mid-sized manufacturers with few external resources to draw from. As MIT professor Susanna Berger explains, all growth depends on internal resources. They do not find any complementary capabilities they can draw on in the industrial ecosystem. End quote. There are a plethora of resources to draw from, and I've got some first-hand experience in this field, so I can tell you it's virtually all foreign countries. China mainly, but also Taiwan, the Philippines, India, Pakistan, and Mexico are the big players. The beautiful part of this exterior money vortex is that inevitably you are utilizing the same resources as your competition, in some cases buying resources directly from your competition for resale or reuse. That's not to say that at least some of the same resources are not available domestically in the United States, but that doing so is cost prohibitive to the point of making your business uncompetitive in the market. Even the legal terminology of the industry has been warped to the point of being meaningless. Substantial transformation, for instance. So this is from trade.gov. Substantial transformation means that the good underwent a fundamental change in form, appearance, nature, or character, This fundamental change normally occurs as a result of processing or manufacturing in the country claiming origin. Claiming origin. Claiming. Claiming. It's the world we live in now. What did Mr. Lincoln say first the lawyers? I'm sure he was joking. So, made in America may just be a ruse for made in China, assembled in America, or insert various other possible countries of origin. Your prospective competition, no matter what industry you're in, will not hesitate to use the cheap option to swipe your customer base. And they know how poor average Americans are getting, so the price point will almost always be a number one issue. If you're building a business only on U.S. materials, resources, labor, and services, you'd better be popping out Tiffany cufflinks. Your target demographic must be the rich. Back to the Lloyd article here. Quote, in the 1990s, the American banking industry also went through a period of significant change, specifically consolidation. This occurred due to several fundamental changes to bank industry regulations. The Rigel-Neal Interstate Banking and Branching Efficiency Act of 1994 allowed branch banking beyond one state and throughout the United States. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999 allowed banks to enter other financial markets and provide additional financial services. The Glass-Steagall Act was reformed in 1999 to allow banks to conduct commercial banking alongside investment banking, which was banned after the Great Depression. For good reason. And my apologies for not circling back around to the Glass-Steagall Act in my first video. I know I mentioned that in my list of things that cause inflation and dollar devaluation, and it does and still does. We'll get into that later. This video is not about Glass-Steagall, but back to the quote here. These policies allowed banks to operate across state lines, expand their services, and combine commercial banking with investment banking. This created an attractive environment for mergers and acquisitions. As a result, independent local banks were acquired by national and international banks. What? In 1980. In 1980, there were over 19,000 banks operating in the United States. By 2010, this declined 60% to only 7,000 institutions. These local banking relationships were the lifeblood of small and mid-sized manufacturing firms. The majority of the U.S. manufacturing sector belongs to 250,000 small and mid-sized firms, representing 86% of our manufacturing workforce and producing 46% of private sector non-farm output. However, these companies relied on local banking relationships as their primary source of capital, and it was no longer readily available. As a result, manufacturing investments in new technologies and capital equipment stagnated and slowly eroded manufacturers' global competitiveness. And the quote here, that's interesting, Bond Villain and Singer. I just noticed this guy's name is weird. Bond Villain? Seriously? Why do these folks always have comic book character names? It should come as no surprise to folks that have watched my first video that the consolidation of banking transpired shortly after the mass exodus of labor to foreign markets. I got this from Gulag's Bard AI. Are they still calling it Bard? So Google AI says, quote, China became a member of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, on December 11, 2001. Wow, that's interesting. Wasn't there something else that happened that just before that? Another day that also started in 11 that same year? Weren't there some remote control planes that slammed them? After a lengthy negotiation process. Okay. China became a member of the World Trade Organization on December 11, 2001, after a lengthy negotiation process and significant economic changes. China's membership has had many benefits. This is from Google, okay? Many benefits for China, I'll add parenthetically, including foreign direct investment. China has become a major destination for foreign direct investment and also has become a significant source of outward investment. Economic growth. China's economy is 11 times larger than it was in 2001. And the share of the Chinese population living in extreme poverty declined from 67% to under 1% from 1990 to 2015. Trade in goods between the United States and China increased from less than $100 billion in 1999 to $558 billion in 2019. And China surpassed Germany to become the world's largest exporter in 2009. End quote. $558 billion. Billion dollars. So doing some digging around here, in the year 2000, the U.S. export amount was $1.1 trillion. In 2019, U.S. exports totaled $1.6 trillion. But these figures don't factor in inflation, do they? So let's do that real quick. Let's factor in inflation to the 2019 figure. So if you use the handy-dandy tool, inflationcalculator.com, assuming a modest 22% inflation rate, and remember that the inflation rate is always cumulative. I've not seen a negative inflation rate here in America in my 40 years on Earth. I suspect I never will. So that cumulative inflation rate is the one you want to use. Making $1.6 trillion have the effective buying power of $1,248,000,000 or $1.2 trillion. And that's weird, isn't it? In other words, the U.S. export amount barely moved the needle in almost 2 decades. Someone make this math for me. How is it possible to blow up China's economy 5-fold and barely put a dent in U.S. exports? I smell fakeness in the numbers going on here, but what do you expect? It's gulag. Also, what the foxtrot is going on with that enormous dip in poverty for China? And now we're getting into the territory of things that, words and things that you can't say on the interweb, or gulag gremlins come out to mess with visibility. This article is from the Charlie Foxtrot Romeo. Quote, economically, the United States saw some benefits, and this is in regards to WTO's acceptance of China, and some downsides. Consumers broadly benefited from China's WTO entry because they could buy goods from China at lower prices. Corporations profited from increased access to China's massive market. In 2017, for example, Chinese consumers accounted for about 15% of Apple's sales. And since 2001, U.S. exports to China have skyrocketed by 450%. Apple sales in China. Would these happen to be the Foxconn manufactured Chinese-made Apple products? Is it really an export if the American company in question here is producing said products in China? Back to the quote. However, labor unions in manufacturing and factory work opposed a WTO accession deal, certain that cheaper labor in China would cost jobs in the United States. And they were right! Between 1999 and 2011, almost 6 million U.S. Wow, that's an interesting number there. U.S. manufacturing jobs were lost. A landmark study attributed nearly 1 million of those manufacturing job losses and 2.4 million total job losses to competition from China. But because major technological advances such as automation occurred in that same time frame, economists disagree about exactly how responsible Chinese competition was for the job losses in manufacturing. Okay, that's the end of the quote here. Robots. It's either robots or China. I don't think it makes much of a difference to the working Americans that lost their jobs. Either way, it's hoovering wealth from Americans. That's either in concentrating it at the top of society, when businesses can automate domestic operations, or shipping Chinese-made goods to the U.S. And by the way, does it really count as a job loss if China is the one automating? And how many of those robots used domestically were built in China or elsewhere? Asking for a friend, bro. Asking for a friend. The point of this little exercise, the point of all of this, and that huge list that I brought up at the beginning here, is to illustrate just how wide-reaching the problem becomes when outsourcing labor to a foreign market, any foreign market, but particularly one where labor costs are exponentially cheaper than they are in the home country, in this case the United States. But this can apply to any country. Exporting one's manufacturing base to a foreign country is the death of that country's economy. It's guaranteed. I think the reason for it is to bring the United States to parity with China. You know, people have said it has to do with money, and I'm sure greed is in there somewhere. It always is. You can't get rid of greed. You can't eliminate greed with a policy or an ideology. We could try going back to the old ways, virtue, morality, and religion, the staples that built America, but that's a much longer process and a much longer video. Material acquisition, chemical industry, material processing, component manufacturing, machining, tool manufacturing, surface treatment and finishing, assembly and quality control, packaging, distribution, retail, marketing and sales, customer delivery, e-commerce, after-sales services, warranty and customer support. All of these industries, all of them outsourced to a foreign market, which represents hundreds of thousands of jobs lost, hundreds of thousands of payroll employees lost to a foreign country. So when you talk about even purchasing a single product from a niche market, this is example I'm giving is tools, pretty ubiquitous across the world. Everybody needs them. Everybody uses them. But again, this could apply to any industry, and so much more so, the more complex that industry. Electronics manufacturing, automotive manufacturing, aircraft engineering. When you start factoring in all the different industries that we've allowed to be outsourced to foreign countries, the picture becomes far more grim. I can't remember the guy's name. I think he's the president of some South American country. He said, there's enough money for everybody if no one steals. And that is the quintessential truth of our generation. There's enough money for everybody if nobody steals. If we have fair money, if we had it, we used to have it. If we had fair money, if we had honest wages, if we had equal trade, not free trade. Screw free trade. Free trade assumes that all partners at the bargaining table are operating on common footing. We are not, and haven't been for a long time now. This is one-sided. You don't have one country suddenly uplift itself out of poverty in the span of 2 decades and no one else suffers for it. Somebody's screwing with the numbers here. It's pretty obvious that that is the case. Just look around America. How many factories do you see operating? How many factory workers do you know personally? Probably not many. And what are the wages that those industries pay? We're being brought down to parity with foreign countries that treat their workers like second-class citizens, because that's how they view their citizens. And that's how they want these multinational organizations like WTO, that's how they want all countries to operate, including the United States. When we entered into this agreement, it was one-sided. It still is. Now, I've heard people like Ron Paul argue that, well, this allows American consumers to purchase cheaper products and services. Yes, it does. But the flip side of that is 3/4 of the money that's involved in that industry that gets outsourced goes to the foreign country. Virtually none of it comes back to us. Is China buying our weapons? Is China buying our aircraft? Not in the quantities that would make this particular relationship serviceable. For the rest of us, for the billionaire and trillionaire class, sure. No, I know, there's no trillionaires. You get my meaning here. Ostensibly, there aren't any, right? There's enough money to go around. The problem isn't about money. The problem is about power. It's about stripping power from Americans so that we live hand to mouth constantly and can't question the systems that are in place here. They don't want a educated and self-sustaining populace. They want us weak, dependent, poor. The easiest way to get us into the situation that we're in right now is to make everybody equally poor and desperate. And the best way to do that is to take all of the good paying jobs away. And that way we'll all beg for universal basic income. Because there's no outlet. There's nowhere to go. Let me go on Indeed.com and see if I can find a job to make $40 an hour or more. That's the minimum. If you want a job that supports a family, if you want a job where you can buy a house eventually, someday, like we used to do in the good old days, when your dad turned wrenches at Firestone and he could save up his money for 10, 15 years and put that down payment on a house, or his grandpappy before that, who could buy it outright in cash. Remember those days? But we don't live in that world anymore, and we don't live in that world for a reason. The idea that we're somehow going to outsupply the demand and the prices are going to, what? What do you think they're going to do? There's plenty of land, there's plenty of buildings, there's plenty of apartments that are not even being occupied right now because their holders want ridiculous sums of money for them. Money that people just aren't making right now. And you want to get a nice sized house? You better get some freaking roommates. You better get like 4 or 5 of them, jam us in there like a bunch of Mexicans. I have no qualms with China or any other country entering into the global trading market. I think it's a great thing that China was able to lift itself out of poverty, at least according to this article and others like it. That's awesome. But doing so at the expense of others in a zero-sum game that has been constructed to be a zero-sum game is a raw deal for America. And it's a raw deal for everyone else that suffered under this system. This idea, by the way, that's been percolated from the ultra-riche, the Whiskey Echo Foxtrots and the Davos Group's contingent, that countries should be specialized, and that's their market. And China has been tapped for industry, and America has been tapped for service. Is that the future that you want for your kids? Do you want your kids to work at retail and the Taco Bell for wages on parity with China and other supposedly developing nations? What's the reason for this, by the way? Sustainability? This is not sustainable. When you look at what goes into versus what goes out of, as John used to say on RBN, it doesn't math up. Again, going back to the poverty pill video that I did a few weeks ago, those 47% of Americans that are making less than $60K a year can't even afford their own apartment on their own. As a grown adult in the United States of America, you don't make enough money to support yourself. That's buying the food, gas, and all the other essentials and pay the rent and utilities if you're not making at least $60K a year. You can't do it, not without roommates or living with family. All of this comes back to these 2 central issues: honest money and domestic industry. And if you don't have those 2 things, you will not for long, have a functioning economy or a nation. And there is no reason why we shouldn't have our own industrial base. There is no reason why all of this stuff should have been shipped overseas in the first place. Zero. We had that manufacturing base. We were the industrial powerhouse of the world, and we let it all slip away for shareholders, for stakeholders, for these corporate tycoons where they just keep shoving money to the top. Because the only way to keep the monster running is to make sure the rest of us are too poor to make the arguments that I'm making right now, that every single American in this country should be making right now. The bleeding of American industry needs to end yesterday. People are angry. In general, you can feel it in the air. The last time it was this bad was back in 2015. And we remember the rhetoric, and it has gotten worse ever since. And right now, the fixation for folks is on this 2024 presidential election and the unfortunate events that transpired yesterday at a Trump rally. There was an attempted deletion, we'll call it, so the gremlins don't come for me here, which thankfully did not succeed. This is going to set a precedent, going beyond political rhetoric and enmity to outright violence and kinetic action or special activities, if this was some kind of a Fed operation. Irrational fear and anger is one thing, and there is a ton of it out there. But rational fears and rational angers, things that are logically would conclude in anger and fear, these are problems that you can only treat by treating directly, not the symptoms. The only way you can encourage growth in a given area is by increasing wages. This is the easiest and tried and true way of increasing tax revenue for a state also. Another option is to increase population. But when you increase population, you increase the demand on infrastructure. And there is a diminishing returns effect on that. It would behoove the United States federal government to improve our economic conditions, which begs the question of why it is in these last God knows how many decades they have not made a concerted effort to do so. I can only come to the conclusion that it is not desired that Americans should live prosperous lives. It is desired that America become a second world country, because that is the course that we've been on. Since I've been alive, looking back through the history of the foreign and domestic policy that this country has engaged with, I can only come to that conclusion. But somebody help me make a different kind of sense if you don't think that's the case. Why else would you do this to a country? Why would you allow this to happen, and to happen for so long without doing anything about it? And we keep trying to put tariffs on China. Oh, here's a tariff, here's a tariff. Why are we borrowing money from a foreign country that's supposedly our enemy? The media moves their mouths and tells us China this, China that, China, China, China. And meanwhile, we keep trading with China. We keep borrowing money from China. So are they the enemy? Why do business with your enemy? Why this system if they are the enemy? And by the way, I don't think China's the enemy. I don't think you've got people sitting in, Chinese people sitting in their living room talking about overthrowing the United States. I don't think that's a thing. I think Chinese people are like American people. They care about themselves. They care about their family. They care about making it from one day until the next. And that's pretty much it. Normal people trying to provide for themselves and their loved ones. And that's the struggle of most people in the world. Most people in the world, they're not out trying to manipulate people and do violence on people. And sure, there are those that do. And those are the outliers. Those are the ones that wind up on the 6 o'clock news. I don't know what else to say. These things have been in place for so long, and the jargon surrounding these issues so ingrained that you have even staunch constitutional folks like Ron Paul talking about the benefits of free trade. Unbelievable. I'm all for equal trade. Then we can trade freely. If you want to trade on equal footing, then we can trade freely. It's interesting that this Charlie Foxtrot Romeo article brings up the fact that when this 2001 accession for China went through, that we also had innovations in automation and robotics happen around the same time. Because my running theory with one of the reasons why this Whiskey Tango Oscar deal went through in the first place is in preparation for the United States and the globe for full rollout of full automation of industry. In other words, can you see a difference between, say, if all of America's industry were offloaded to China versus all of America's industry became automated? Can you see a difference in those two outcomes? The only difference, I suppose, you could argue, would be that there'd be more wealth consolidation at the top of society. But that's exactly how it's transpired to date, in my opinion. There'd just be more of it. Now, I don't know what the maintenance side of these automated industries would look like, but it would seem to follow to reason if you can fully automate any industry, you can probably automate maintenance of that automation as well. I bet you never thought the Jetsons would look like this.